Well, thank you all for coming. The Los Angeles Times is one of the nation's greatest papers, and it is also the flagship paper of this state. So it's a particular pleasure that we can welcome here tonight John Carroll, its editor. Now, to help us tonight is Michael Krasny, who all of you know. Michael will engage in an onstage conversation with John Carroll, and Michael is one of the unparalleled interlocutors. It's not an easy thing to do. He has a PhD in English literature, if recollection serves, still teaches, I don't know how he finds the time, and of course is on daily on the program Forum on KQED. So please join me in welcoming John Carroll and Michael Krasny.
Thank you. Good evening. I know it's a little strange for some of you to put this face with the voice. Steve Jobs said to me recently, "You're supposed to be in my dashboard." I'm actually sorry to say that we're going to have to begin on a little bit of a solemn note because though you'll meet John Carroll and we'll have a chance to talk about many things, particularly some of those that were advertised this evening, I regret to say that he lost, and the Los Angeles Times lost, and we all lost a major journalist today, and it came as a shock to him. He just heard about it, and so I thought it would be in the interest of full disclosure, really, not only to let you know that, but to let you know that he's being a good soldier here, because I know that he must be going through some strong emotional responses. But I think the best tribute that we can have, at least before we go into our discussion, is to talk about who we lost and what he represented to the paper.
I think some of you may know him. His name is Frank DeLomo. He was 55 years old. He died in our newsroom today. And Frank had been at the paper many years. He had participated as a leading reporter in a story about Latinos in Los Angeles that was published in 1983, and which won a Pulitzer Prize in 1984. And in addition to being a very accomplished reporter, columnist, and editor, Frank was to some extent the conscience of the paper as regards diversity, particularly with regard to Latinos. There are uncounted people in our business who wouldn't be there if it weren't for the direct help or the indirect help of Frank DeLomo. So quite a few people are in mourning over this. Perhaps some of you here have had contact with Frank. He's nationally known for his advocacy, which he did with tenacity but an amazing gentleness. A wonderful man. And so that's what happened today. I'm sorry to start our program out by mentioning it, but it seemed the right thing to do. But I'll assure you we'll have a good time tonight.
Well, sympathies to the whole Los Angeles Times staff and all who knew him. It might be a good place to begin, though, in deference to his memory and to what he stood for, to talk about the difficulties facing your newspaper in terms of having the kind of ethnic diversity that many cherish and that he certainly cherished and worked for so assiduously, and the challenges that are going to continue, perhaps, now that he's gone.
Well, it's a difficult problem. We've put a lot into it through various programs, but the moving target we're trying to hit is moving faster than we can, and that is the change in the demographic makeup of Los Angeles and of California. So even though we have a more diverse staff than many other papers, we don't match up well with our community at all, and we've got a lot to do. Here's a good sign. There's a straw in the wind for you if you're feeling that this is a downbeat expression on this subject. When I came to Los Angeles, I felt that one of the major needs of the paper, and the paper was very strong. It was in a state of poor morale because of the Staples affair, and yet the underlying newspaper and the talent in it was very strong. But we needed to make a lot of changes in the editing structure. We didn't have enough strong editors. We had some very fine editors, but not enough. And in looking for key editors, I suddenly realized how years and years of struggle and strife over African Americans in the newsroom had finally paid off. I can't tell you the number of times as an editor that I was either directly or by implication accused of not trying very hard, perhaps even being a racist, because I didn't have enough African American leadership in my newsroom. And it's been difficult. But when I went out to look this time, the number one candidate I could find for managing editor, and I didn't give him a single point for race, happened to be African American, Dean Baquet, who was then the national editor of the New York Times, and he is proving to be I think there's not a better rising editor in America. And a deputy managing editor I hired, Joe Hutchinson, is our chief of design and runs a great department of designers who have been very successful, and so on. I don't want to list everybody, but without what I want to make as my point is that without benefit of any affirmative action, any special credit for anything other than talent, African Americans are now coming to the very top of the heap. Latinos are a bit behind, but it'll come. It'll take a lot of work, though.
Many young people here who are thinking about journalism, and journalists now are finding it difficult to get work. Advertising isn't what it was. You've got the new media, which we'll talk about, which I know you like to talk about, as opposed to, this isn't like Rumsfeld, old Europe and new Europe, but in a way it is. The old media being, the more traditional media, newspapers and so forth, and the new media being the internet and all of that, Fox News. Old seems better, doesn't it? The sense of young people now beginning a career or aspiring to a career in journalism can be a little disheartening. And I wonder what you could say maybe that might be more encouraging to those who at least have their eye on maybe some kind of plum reporting assignment or getting in a newsroom or finding a job, especially given the fact that there may be even more competition for kids who are not ethnic now, because you want to have racial diversity.
Well, I still believe that for someone who really wants it, is highly motivated, is potentially good at it, perhaps not that good yet, there are wonderful places to work and wonderful editors to work for who can help you be better. And I think there's no more important decision that a young person can make than choosing the editor very carefully. And don't necessarily go for the big name paper, but go for the paper that has a great editor. If you have a choice between going to the Los Angeles Times and working in a department that you've figured out isn't that great, and going to Concord, New Hampshire, to the Daily Monitor, go to Concord. Its editor there is named Mike Pride, and I don't know of any paper anywhere near as small as that turns out more first-rate reporters who now work at places like the LA Times, the Washington Post, and so on. It's quite remarkable. And so find that editor, and if you've got questions, you can email me, and I can tell you who some of those editors are.
You give them the real skinny, will you? Yeah, as we used to say.
I'll do it. Well, I'll be happy to.
What would you say to encourage young people, though? I mean, given the fact that so many are exposed to the newer media. I mean, my daughter, who is college age, gets all her news off the internet. She doesn't read a newspaper in print anymore, and a lot of young people are drawn to, let's say, the more infotainment world,
right,
which you have to compete with. Why go into old traditional craft of journalism as opposed to going into some of the more sexier kinds of things that are out there?
Well, in my opinion, I'll paint with a broad brush here. Much of the new sexy stuff isn't journalism. By journalism, and I'm a very old-fashioned conservative guy on this, I mean the type of work in which you revere facts, and it pains you when you get a fact wrong. Getting truth is something else, almost beyond description in its difficulty, but simply getting the facts is something that is achievable and is valuable And at a newspaper that has a tradition of that, it's important. Now, I work at the LA Times, and we take it very seriously. We take it very seriously because we think our boss really is not the publisher, it's not even the editor, it's not the board of directors, and this is a great heresy among the business world, but it's not the stockholders. I said to a class a little earlier that if I had a reporter who came to work for me, and he said that the thing that really cranked him up in the morning was to come in and serve the stockholders, that reporter would never get a good assignment and might not be allowed to even stay on the staff. But the thing that characterizes the best of the old media is devotion to facts. We're like bricklayers. We're just looking for good bricks and we want to lay them level. And devotion to the reader and recognizing that the reader is sovereign. We make a lot of mistakes at the LA Times. We published more than 2,700 corrections last year. You might say, God, what an awful paper that must be. They can't get anything right. But the fact is, errors of fact are inherent in daily journalism, and it's incumbent on us to correct them. We correct them because we work for our readers, and we misled them, and we owe that to them. We also owe it to future journalism because it goes in our electronic files, in our databases. If there's an error in your story, across the top of that story in the database, it will say correction, and provide the correction even before you've read the story. That prevents the same errors from being repeated. And we take them very seriously for that reason.
It's heartening to hear you talk about the devotion of the readers and the high ideal of working for the readers being your boss and everything, but of course you're running a business and you've got to sell commercial space and you have to please the board of directors or whoever is in charge of things in the corporate sense. Talk a little bit about how those two can come in conflict, and when they do come in conflict, first of all, it must provide some torment for you, but how you adjudicate between the sense of what may be the needs of the readers and what sometimes may be in conflict with that, with the needs of the people you have to answer to.
Well, they can come into conflict at times. Certainly the interest of readers can come into conflict with the interest of advertisers. And every good newspaper has an advertising boycott occasionally. We lost some advertisers when we published the stories about Arnold Schwarzenegger. Fortunately, we didn't lose enough that it put us too badly in the hole, but it can happen, and that's part of the price you pay.
Were these SUV advertisers, or?
I don't even know. That's one of the good things about my job. I've got a publisher who doesn't expect me to worry about the business side. And I really am very insulated from it. But in lots of companies, you're not. There's an inherent corruption in some places. And there's a lot of pressure to publish what the advertisers want and not what you ought to publish. But it's always been that way. That's not only true under modern big corporate ownership. That was probably equally true under local owners. Some of the worst papers you'll ever see were published before the corporations got so big.
Also a lot of pressure to publish things that are sensational and things that are tabloid. I remember, as I'm sure you do, and it was a watermark for me when the New York Times decided to reveal the name of the victim, the alleged victim of William Kennedy Smith, the rapist who was related to the Kennedy family. And the National Enquirer would not reveal the name, but the New York Times decided to do that. And I thought, here we've come to a point in our culture where the two seem to be shifting in terms of what they were traditionally maybe bound to do or thought to do. Do you feel under a compunction sometimes, I mean, especially with all of the infotainment out there and tabloidization, to compete with that, to go apart from the journalistic craft as you see it?
It forces us to think about these things, but we have a policy that we're not going to let Matt Drudge set our standards at the paper. And we certainly lived by that over the last week when Matt Drudge reported the possibility that John Kerry had had an affair with an intern. And we didn't take Matt Drudge's word for it. We tried to find any evidence that this occurred, and we were able to find none, and I'm happy to say we didn't publish a word about it.
How can we hold people like Drudge accountable in a case like that? Just your thoughts upon it.
You know, I think that over the long haul, people will figure out that a lot of what they get on the web and on the talk shows is not journalism. It is not based on facts. It is not, they are not accountable to readers or to listeners. It is marketing. Sticking closely to the facts is not a high priority there. Correcting errors is not a priority there. And I'm talking about primarily the talk shows. And if you don't do facts, if you don't do corrections, if you don't really regard the reader or the listener as sovereign, it's not journalism. It's marketing. It's politics. It is, in the case of the Fox network and some of the others, that subspecies of politics that's done so much for our civic life, known as attack politics, in which you attack your enemies and try to destroy their characters in the eyes of an audience.
That's smearing, isn't it?
That's smearing.
Yeah.
And it goes on, you know, in our against our paper, against the New York Times, because part of the shtick of this marketing is that we are the ones, we the talk shows are the ones you can trust to tell you the truth, and these rotten old companies cannot be trusted. So listen to us and disregard them. It's marketing, but it is a variant of attack politics. You know, Roger Ailes, who runs Fox News, that's his career, is attack politics. He spent most of his life in politics and is a specialist in destroying reputations of people who he perceives to be on the other side. So it's a rough game, and it's a different game. You know, if I can expand on this for 1 minute, I had a revelation while driving down the highway. Actually, not driving, just sitting in traffic. That's what we do down there. And I was flipping the dial. This is a couple of months ago, and one of the stations was replaying the famous 1938 broadcast of War of the Worlds, done by Orson Welles. And some of you, I'm sure, are aware that this was a broadcast of a supposed attack by Martians on the United States. And in 1938, it actually caused mass panic, serious mass panic. And I'd never heard it before. And when I listened to it, I realized why it had caused mass panic. The announcers had all of the trappings of journalism. They had all of the fashionable diction and intonations used by news broadcasters. And it sounded like a news broadcast done by professional news people with fear, and a little touch of fear in their voices. And along with that, they put experts on, professors and so on, who knew about Mars, and they sounded credible and nervous and uncertain as to what this was going to bring to the world. And it caused a panic. And the reason it caused a panic was that they had taken over the appearance of being journalists. They weren't journalists. Same thing is happening on the talk shows. This is not journalism, but it is stirring a lot of people up. Now, over the long haul, people are going to prove to be smart enough to realize they've been had, but it'll take a while. And the traditional media, people like the Los Angeles Times, will learn how to counter these things more swiftly and better. I can get into that, but perhaps I've already given you a long answer.
No, I just want to follow up with something else that you've evoked, and that is to ask you about, I mean, you made a clear distinction between what is journalism and what isn't journalism. What about what's called gotcha journalism? I mean, Gary Hart goes out on a boat, and they have photographs, and they say, gotcha. Clinton is with Monica Lewinsky, and they say, you know, we've got the dress, gotcha. I mean, that's become very much a part of the warp and woof of what we call journalism today, and yet some people find it offensive, and some people find it downright not what journalism maybe in its best sense ought to be.
I don't know quite where you draw the line between gotcha journalism that's sensationalistic and not of civic value, and investigative reporting that is of the highest civic value. some people thought that our coverage of Arnold Schwarzenegger's treatment of women was seedy and uncouth and had no place in a newspaper. A certain passage in the story struck my wife that way. She straightened me out on that. Unfortunately, it had already been published.
We got a great line as a result of that. Arianna Huffington on my show said he's going to be our most hands-on governor.
There have been quite a few good ones. Glad to have helped that.
Yeah. But you did get an enormous negative reaction. I mean, like Dean Shell said, lost literally thousands of subscriptions, made people very angry at you. Some of that, by the way, was kicked up as hornet's nest from the talk shows. I mean,
Right.
I listen to some of the right-wing talk show hosts. It gets my blood pressure up, but I listen nonetheless. And they were talking about the Los Angeles Times printing things without having any reason to print them about Arnold Schwarzenegger, and essentially completely sullying your character as a newspaper.
Yes, and we expected some of that. When I decided to publish, I told the publisher, I said, this is going to be the worst reaction we've had since we've been here. I'm older than he is, and I've been through some reactions, so I kind of know some of the symptoms and what'll happen. And I made sure we had phone operators ready to take calls and ready to take abuse, who had answers. Why did we publish this? They had it right in front of them, written out. And we expected to get hit hard, and we did. We had a lot of complaints and a lot of subscription cancellations. I was fully prepared to take the rap for everything I did, for all the decisions that I'd made. What surprised me in all this is that I also had to take the rap for things we never did. And I'll tell you how it happened, because I think it's instructive as to the nature of the new media. There were several stories written about the paper that were utter fabrications. The first one actually started with Schwarzenegger himself. When we were interviewing women in Hollywood, we were cold calling people off of the credit lists for the movies, and calling them by the scores and saying, "Do you know anything?" And of course, at least half of them called Arnold, saying, "Gee, Mr. Schwarzenegger, these guys are trying to do something bad to you." And so the word got back to him, and actually it was mentioned on the web that we were doing this interviewing. It was known. We couldn't keep it secret. And Schwarzenegger went on the national television and declared that the Los Angeles Times was actually working for and with Governor Davis. And I was sort of taken back by that. He actually said he was told that by the editor. That's me. So we had a good laugh around the office about that. But then, interestingly enough, some of the members of the media, not the well-known ones, but some who are kind of on the fringes, followed Schwarzenegger's lead and started reporting that they had hard information that the LA Times was working for the governor. And never was a name named or a place or an event. It was just that they knew it to be true. And it was these articles reporting that we were working for Gray Davis. Now, why would I choose Gray Davis if I'm going to do this? I mean, the most loathed person in California, why would I make that affiliation? But at any rate, it was reported, it was like sightings of Elvis. And these reports, which would hit the web, would then go all over the web, and then they'd get on the talk shows, and they would be repeated and repeated and repeated. There were a number of things like that reported about the paper. The most egregious was written by a self-employed columnist who said that she knew for sure that the Los Angeles Times had published an account, had written its account of Arnold's misbehavior 2 weeks in advance of publication, and had held it to time it to wreak maximum political damage to Schwarzenegger. This would have been almost a capital crime in our business if we had actually done it. And it seems so preposterous that in the past, without the new media, you would just let a story like that lie and it would die of its own rot. But in this case, it was immediately seized in this vortex of electronic media, and the author of it was suddenly on every cable channel you can find nationally. And millions, literally millions of people were told that we did this, which, as I've said, and I choose the word carefully, was a fabrication. So I think our reputation was actually harmed. Our good name was harmed by that. So what lesson do you draw from that? Well, journalism is an interesting business. You learn that you learn by your mistakes and your derelictions, and you get better each time. Here's how I intend to get better. I think that in the past we could let these things go by. Now, if someone says or writes something that goes to the heart of the newspaper's integrity, they will hear from me with copies to every internet outlet I can find within that news cycle. We will not allow it to pass again because it did us a lot of damage. And you hate to get into disputes of this sort, but we're in a situation now where it can't be avoided.
On the other hand, there may be a brighter side. Let me spin it for you to this, and that is, recently I was on a Bay Area economic forum with Dan Walters, who's a premier political writer for the Sacramento Bee, state politics. He was very funny. He was saying that the whole Schwarzenegger phenomenon was unlike anything he'd ever seen because, first of all, you had TV crews from Jakarta, coming to cover. So there'd be a freeway chase in Los Angeles, and yet there were reporters who weren't covering that. They were covering budget meetings because, this is a movie star, after all. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most popular and successful movie star in the world. To some extent, it's been your desire, I know, and you've been very open about this, to want to be the paper of record for the West, to have a national exposure and a national profile as a Western paper. To some extent, though you were maligned and there was character assassination in the paper, the new media did this for you with Schwarzenegger because you were the paper on record and you were the only paper that stuck out and went on a limb on this, right?
That's true. We were, to this day, no other publication has originated a single case about women and Arnold. Either we are way out of bounds on this, or the rest of the entire thousands of media people who came here to cover Arnold missed something. I've got an opinion on that.
Yeah, I bet you do. What do you see as the dangers? We wanted to talk about First Amendment tonight, the dangers of the new media. It's not journalism, as you say. It's often entertainment and sensationalism. And what can it do to what we like to think of as the sanctity of the First Amendment? And then I want to talk to you as an editor about what you feel is important in terms of protecting the First Amendment. But first of all, the dangers as you see them.
Well, I do see dangers in the blending of entertainment values with news values, which is occurring in the media and in politics, as we've seen. And I think that it diminishes the credibility of the papers and of the media generally. I think a lot of people see no difference between those who kind of make it up and those of us who really work hard to do it properly. And I think part of that is that newspapers tend to be too cheap to promote themselves and to let people know what they do and that they do it differently. That's our fault, and we'll have to address that. I also think, and I draw my paycheck from a very large corporation, so I am in a little bit of an awkward position saying this, but I do think that the bigger that these companies get, the less the public trusts them, and that they tend to regard it as a business and as something that you make money with, not as something that you serve the public interest with. And if the public does come to believe that more and more, the public support that maintains our First Amendment privilege will erode, and has eroded, I believe, for a number of reasons. So it's, I don't think it's about to go. I don't think the First Amendment's going to be repealed, but it does make me concerned.
Well, how many of you in the audience know the name Ben Bagdikian, just out of curiosity? He was predecessor of Dean Shell and dean of the journalism school here for a number of years and an icon to particularly many journalists, progressive, so-called progressive journalists especially. And he's written kind of the classic text about media monolith and how it's difficult to separate ideology and it's difficult to really protect the First Amendment in many instances because of the profit motive. Because the profit motive eclipses everything else and begins to take over the kind of good ethics that you've laid out for us here and begins to undermine and erode those ethics.
You know, it's very interesting because I think, in my opinion, and I'm 62 years old, so I've been around longer than many people in the audience, that in my lifetime, the pendulum has swung farther than I would ever have expected it in the direction of business values triumphing over other values in the society. And I can remember a discussion I had with someone on the business side of the Baltimore Sun, and he was sincere and he was intelligent, but he was a business-oriented person. And we were discussing budgets and what newspapers are supposed to do. And he said to me, in all sincerity, that in the end, you really have only one obligation, and that is to serve the shareholders. It comes down to that. And I suspect, I don't know this, I never looked it up or asked anybody, but I suspect that may actually be legally the case, that these are businesses.
It's a fiduciary responsibility.
Fiduciary responsibility trumps all else. But as I indicated earlier, not one person in any newsroom I know of believes that. Not one good journalist thinks that they serve the shareholders, they serve the public. And if the two come into conflict, you've got to sound off, and if it's bad enough, you've got to leave. And that happens.
Classic case, though, comes to mind that Ben Bagdikian writes about, and that is RCA and NBC, and RCA had been involved in, the corporation had been involved in some activity that was generating nuclear energy in nuclear plants, and there was concern about nuclear waste and all that. And NBC didn't run the stories. Now, did they not run the stories because they weren't on the ball as journalists, or did they not run the story because of the fear of subtle pressure from the corporation? This is the kind of quandary that so many face, and I'm sure you face on a daily basis.
Yes, and even if they did the right thing, they made the right decision, their motives would be suspect, and their credibility would be lost because of that. You know, the company I work for, Tribune Company, owns the Chicago Cubs, and I would just hate to have to be supervising the sports department of the Tribune and being second-guessed by everybody. You're either being too harsh on them because you're trying to prove you're not bought, or you're being too easy on them because you have been bought. But your motives are never, can never be demonstrated to be anything like pure. It's a bad situation.
Yeah. And it's one you have to, I assume, take almost on a day-to-day basis.
Well, in LA,
case-to-case basis,
it's not such a problem. But we have conflicts. For example, the company I work for was one of the companies that advocated the loosening of the rules on owning newspapers, owning television stations, and that whole cluster of rules that were being considered in Washington last year. And we went out of our way to really cover that in depth and to cover the voices of the people who thought this was a bad thing, even though our company was lobbying for it. And I was proud of the job we did, but nevertheless, every word you write is suspect because your company is an active player in that issue.
So give us an idea how you're going to make, or how you envision making, the Los Angeles Times competitive with the elitist national papers, Washington Post, New York Times, Boston Globe. I mean, certainly you have the resources, and you have the desire, and yet you have a blueprint, you have a map on it.
It involves, first of all, the very basics, the things I talked about, not losing sight of the business we're in. We're bricklayers and we deal in facts. I think anytime you start thinking you're pretty slick and you're pretty smart, you're headed for a fall in this business. I've had a lot of falls, and
so stay honest and avoid hubris.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
A little humility helps. But we've been very fortunate. One of the things that we have going for us is the size of the LA area, which gives us the economic base to maintain a staff of over 1,100 journalists. which is the largest staff, I think, west of Manhattan and pretty close to the largest anywhere. And with that and with the other resources that we have, we can cover the world. So our job in developing the paper and achieving our ambitions is to be good at not one thing, but a lot of things. Foreign coverage. We've got 24 foreign bureaus, including the newly acquired Baghdad Bureau.
Had you cut back before 9/11?
No, we had not. We stuck to our knitting.
So many newspapers had. Yeah.
And, you know, before 9/11, you can look this up, a lot of the journalism companies, such as Gannett, were actually disparaging government coverage as something that was kind of old-fashioned and people didn't care about anymore. So they were publishing nice papers that had really keen story about people's pets on page one. And we, being old-fashioned plotting, were actually covering Washington with a bureau of more than 50 people and covering foreign news with 25 or 30 people at any given time. And nobody was interested in it, at least supposedly. And then suddenly 9/11 came, and everybody wanted to know what was happening overseas and what Washington was doing about it. And the story really came to us. And I was so happy to see those chickens come home to roost, not just for my own paper, but just for journalism in general. I think that a lot of the, you know, even the news magazines had to just cut this froth out of their things and actually cover the story. It was really good for journalism. September 11th was a bad thing, but it was great for the right values in our business. So that we're trying to do that, but we want to be a great paper for the nation, for the world, and also for California. And there are many other things that go with it. I mean, you've got to publish a complete paper with a good magazine and a lot of other things.
With the Schwarzenegger story, I'm wondering also, because I remember when All the President's Men came out and journalism departments were buzzing with young people who wanted to be investigative reporters, and then there were pretty stringent cutbacks in investigative reporter hiring. Where are you now in terms of your staff and possible more hiring with investigative reportage? Or?
We'll be doing a little. We hired a woman named Deb Nelson to run our she came from the Washington Post, to run our investigative reporting in Washington, and they have just been hitting the ball out of the park. They won Pulitzers 2 out of the last 3 years. We just published a story a month or so ago.
That's not when you were on the Pulitzer Committee, no?
It actually was. I've been termed out. They have term limits on the Pulitzer board, so I'm out of there. We may never win another one, but
you never recuse yourself. Huh?
They forced me to leave the room. But we ran a story a month or 2 ago by David Willman, which I think there's some professional jealousy on the story because the other papers didn't give it much play. But he discovered that at the National Institutes of Health, which are near Washington, and are the nation's, the public's, primary research laboratories against AIDS, tuberculosis, heart disease, mental illness, and all other scourges of that sort, that at NIH, which had been independent since its inception early in the 20th century, and had been serving only a single client, which is to say you and me, the public, had quietly, without any notice at all, allowed its key scientists to take salaries and stock options from drug companies. You didn't know that. Other papers didn't pick it up. And not only that, there are rules and laws that require people in government to disclose their outside income, particularly people at high levels like these research scientists who are paid a couple $100,000 a year. And they had distorted those FOI, Freedom of Information laws, by a series of interpretations that allowed them not to report it. I won't go into the details except to say that they decided, for example, if you were drawing $200,000 a year, they would put you in a salary range, a salary bracket that would go from, say, $80,000 to $210,000. And if the bottom of the salary bracket was below the level at which you had to disclose. Even if you were above the level, in actuality, you didn't have to disclose. So all these people were able to keep this secret. Within the last month, the Congress they read our stories. They are doing away with the secrecy, and they have abolished NIH has said they will not allow any of its scientists to take drug money or stock options from the drug companies. That's the kind of journalism we really want to do through our investigative reporting. Now, you asked a question about the whole of it. We've just had such luck with a Washington Post person in helping us and supervise it in Washington. We've hired another one whose name is Vernon Loeb to supervise our investigative reporting in California. I think California is a baited field for investigative reporting. I'm not aware that there's ever been a newspaper in California that has consistently done great investigative reporting. Certainly my paper does not qualify.
On the other hand, I read a story, and I thought it was a very enlightening and the sort of story you can be as proud of almost as the story you just told. When Otis Chandler turned over the paper's stewardship to McCulloch, McCulloch came in, and he was looking at, the San Gabriel Mountains, and he said, "Who owns these?" And nobody could give him the answer. And he said, "Well, find out." And some investigation eventually was able to uncover the fact that the Teamsters were somehow involved. And it became a major story. I mean, you know, shades of Robert Kennedy and The Enemy Within. The Teamsters suddenly were threatening the major staff of the LA Times life, and it became, as I'm sure you know, well know. And I thought to myself, that's the kind of journalism that really is exciting, isn't it? I mean, that you young people can really get excited about. That's the kind of journalism we want, and that's the kind of journalism I think you're saying you want too.
We do indeed. We've actually got a couple of good investigations going on in California. Of course, I won't tell you what they are, but they've got a lot of promise. But I think we'll be able to step it up. And I looked just at LA County. Here's the picture there. You've got 88 independent municipalities there, of which maybe 30 haven't seen a reporter in 5 years. Nobody covers these things. Unless the laws of human nature have been repealed, there's a lot of stealing going on at those places. I can promise you. It's guaranteed. Now, Californian municipalities are different from eastern ones where they had those old corrupt machines, patronage-oriented, and which provided such wonderful shooting galleries for investigative reporting. But there's a lot of stuff here. This is a gigantic state. It's awash in money. It is, as we've noted, a bigger economy than China, and it has wonderful, colorful politicians, and I really think we're going to make a living off of this state in investigative reporting. I don't want to get too rash about it, but it may not come to pass, but I just got that feeling about it, and I can't wait to get back to the office.
On that note, let us go to the audience and take some of your questions or comments for John Carroll. We can do that, I hope, quite expeditiously, if you'll let me see your hand. Gentleman back here, stand up and speak loudly.
I want to ask you, in terms of this entertainment news and such, if you had any opinion of the Daily Show on Comedy Central?
Are you a Jon Stewart fan, John?
I've seen it, but not enough to have an opinion. But
you don't get your news from that show, do you?
You can learn a lot from those things. I really believe that reading a column in a newspaper isn't the only way to find things out in this world. But sorry I can't help you with an informed opinion about that.
Yes, over here.
I was just wondering if you could comment on what you think the media did to Howard Dean's campaign.
Covered it well, in my opinion. Certainly, I was very proud of our paper's coverage of it. I think, he went the great cycle of being built up and then dropped like a bomb. But it's their job to manipulate us, and it's our job not to be manipulated. And so I feel that coverage has been pretty decent.
There is the argument, I might as well play the devil's advocate here, that so much was made of the so-called I have a scream speech in Iowa, and so much focus and attention was played to it that the media essentially helped Dean's campaign, which one could argue was already imploding because he took a third place at that with 18%, and the other two candidates, Kerry and Edwards, had over 30%, but that the media really exacerbated things. I'm talking about the media in a kind of general, vague way. Made it almost impossible for him, like with Muskie being crying.
No, I actually do think that that was overplayed, and that it was, I saw it, and I didn't think it made him out to be a lunatic at all. I thought it was, but, part of a presidential campaign is it's a test of learning to adapt to an environment, and you've got to know not to do that. To some extent, he flunked a test. You just don't do that. You don't give them something that will make a great film clip for Leno for the next week. And it may not have anything to do with the issues in the campaign, but it does have something to do with your shrewdness. So there's a certain degree of merit in the loss he incurred from that, but I thought it was overdone.
You've mentioned reading Ken Auletta's piece in the New Yorker about the coverage of the White House. Do you feel that there's a sense of tension or perhaps, a real fear or apprehension because of this age of Ashcroft that we live in and because the attitude of the White House has toward the press?
I read that piece, and I'm a Ken Auletta fan, but I do think that I covered the Nixon White House for a brief time, and it's certainly no worse today than it was then, both in terms of the ability of the White House to organize itself to keep everybody at arm's length and to control information, and in generally the way it handles the press, the cynicism, and so on. There's nothing in this White House that hasn't been invented before as far as its handling of the press is concerned, in my opinion.
It's kind of Nixon redux in some ways, isn't it? Yeah. Or a bit. Yes, gentleman in front of you.
I suffer the affliction of being a near lifelong Cub fan, and from something you said, I wonder if Steve Martin might have been secretly working for you. My question is, I was interested in the comment you made about being insulated from the commercial pressures at the LA Times, and as an academic, sort of, we have the same kind of problems here. I'm just wondering if that's an institutional insulation, or is this more a matter of your experience and ability to stay away from it?
It's both. We had a bad experience at the LA Times just before I got there, which occasioned the departure of the entire team that was running the paper, involving a relationship with an advertiser, and a betrayal of the readers. And that's what caused everybody to have to go away. And so I had that going for me when I came in. We weren't about to get into that mess again. Nobody in the building wanted that to happen. So, we had a CEO who used to talk about tearing down the wall between news and advertising. Now, he'd never worked at a newspaper, so he didn't hold the same views that you or I might hold. And he did tear down the walls, and then the wall fell on him and killed him. So, and we have built back the wall. But there is no quarrel at all about it because I have a publisher who believes the wall should be there and covers my back. I really don't have to do any fighting. There are always a lot of little things. I'll give you an example. Lots of advertisers will try to draw up ads that actually look like news and put that in the paper. This happens at every paper. And the publisher from day one, he said, you can decide on every ad whether it's fit to put in the paper. If it confuses readers about whether it's an ad or whether it's news, you can kill it. Often that's more of a negotiated thing between the editor and the advertising chief, but and I, as a courtesy and out of respect for our advertising chief, will talk it over with him. But I have the authority to kill those ads. And it's pretty much that way throughout all those decisions that have to come up. We do them to keep our reputation up.
We'll take a couple more questions. I just can't resist saying to the lifelong Cubs fan, though, there was a reporter at the San Francisco Examiner named Larry Stone, some may even recall his byline, and he put out a sports trivia book recently and sent it to me. And there's an item in there, and I assume it's factual, that a man is buried near Wrigley Field, and on his tombstone, in Yiddish, it says, "The Cubs stink." So I just couldn't resist that. I'm sorry. Way in the back, the gentleman with the blue shirt, yeah.
Hi, Mr. Carroll. I'm wondering if the name Michelle Thomas means anything to you.
It's the name what?
The name Michelle Thomas.
Yes, I noticed the brochures you passed out earlier, or somebody did.
Yeah, that was me passing them out. Your paper published a profile in April 2001 portraying him as a fraud. And your paper received almost 400 letters asking you to correct the record. Why haven't you responded to any of those letters?
I hate to get into this one, but I figured we were going to since we're here in Berkeley. We published a story a while back by a very good and clever reporter named Roy Rivenberg about a man who published his autobiography. And if you read the autobiography, you'd be amazed you'd never heard of this man because he pretty much single-handedly won World War II for us. It was a preposterous book, and our review of it was an investigative review and debunked many of the claims in this book and had some fun doing it, had a few laughs at the author's expense. When you put yourself out into the public and make claims that are preposterous and publish a book on it, you're likely to get a reviewer who will look into that and set the record straight. We were sued by this author, and the lawyers presented their case in preliminary proceedings, and the case was dismissed. And the case was so weak that the poor author who sued us not only had to pay his own legal fees, he was ordered by the court to pay ours, which was a nice outcome for us. Then his legal team became a PR team, set up a website, set up slick brochures such as have been handed out tonight, saying that the paper did something terrible. I'm very proud of that story. We haven't retracted a word of it. We don't intend to, because it was true. And I would like to know, and I'm not asking to get into a debate to you tonight, but where does the money come for lawyers to pursue a case for years that they've already lost and in which the paper was right?
I'd like to respond and tell you that there isn't necessarily money involved. People who know Mr. Thomas and know that all of the facts that your article challenged about him are in fact true and are thoroughly documented on that website and in the brochures that have been handed out tonight, believe so strongly that what your paper did was wrong that they're actually willing to work for free.
With all due respect, this is probably a debate for another evening. You've managed to hand out your brochure, and I appreciate your talking to us. Let's try to get at least somebody from this side of the room over there. Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, hi.
Well, a couple of comments, one of which sort of relates, but you don't have to tie it in if you don't want to. One is about corrections, which you were talking about being so proud of. And they are important. And I agree with that. I have a personal issue, which is that they're usually buried. And often follow-up articles, the first-page articles are hidden. Ones that follow up and say, well, this turned out to be the case. And is there anything we can do as readers and or journalists and or editors to let people know, you know, if you want to know about this issue that we talked about on the front page, the follow-up article is actually over there now.
Well, let me talk about corrections. We run nearly all of our corrections on page 2 of the paper, which is a pretty visible page. Last year we had a reporter in the war who was a photographer, a very fine photographer, who lost his bearings and took 2 images, 2 pictures, and took his laptop and combined them into one to make a better picture. We learned about that, and we had published this picture on page 1. When we found out what had happened, we immediately fired him, and we ran a notice on page 1 saying what had happened, and then inside we ran the 3 images, the 2 real images and the 1 combined image, just to completely air that issue for our readers. So we're not locked into that page 2 thing. You know, there are corrections and there are corrections. It's easy to make most of the corrections we do. We misspell somebody's first name or get a high school sports score wrong. That's 90% of corrections. Then there are some that are more important, in which you've maybe cast a bad light on someone's reputation or something more serious than just a misspelled name. And then beyond that, there's a whole other realm of correction which you will almost never see. And I'll give you a facetious example. I was editor of the Lexington Herald-Leader in Lexington, Kentucky, and it used to publish its corrections on page 2. And we had kind of a joke on the staff that someday we should publish a correction in that spot which says more or less as follows: "It has come to the editor's attention that the Herald-Leader neglected to cover the civil rights movement. We regret the omission." It is true we didn't cover it, but what can you do? It's something, it's almost beyond correction.
I just want to make a correction myself. I heard before I met John Carroll a couple of times people refer to him as out of central casting as an editor of a big newspaper, and yet despite the Hollywood metaphor, I think he's the real article as far as editors go, and I think what he said to you tonight about his belief in how journalism ought to be practiced is quite sincere and quite authentic and comes from a real heartfelt place. I think you've been fortunate indeed to have him here. I want to thank Dean Schell, thank the Chancellor, thank Susan Rasky, thank all who made tonight possible, and thank all of you, and please thank John Carroll.
Thanks.